The sun hung low over the suburban neighborhood, casting long shadows across neatly trimmed lawns and rows of identical cookie-cutter homes. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional chirp of a bird or the distant hum of a lawnmower. It was the kind of place where everything was expected to be perfect, too perfect. And in this picture-perfect world, there existed an unwritten rule. Conformity was king. Ethan, a curious 10-year-old boy with an insatiable imagination, lived with his grandfather, Henry, in a small, unassuming house at the edge of the neighborhood. It was a place where the air smelled of fresh-cut grass, and the houses stood shoulder to shoulder like old friends who'd seen too much of each other. Ethan didn't mind, though. His world was filled with color, with dragons and rocket ships and knights in shining armor. Every day, he'd spend hours crafting masterpieces of pencil, marker, and crayon, carefully taping his drawings to the windows where the world could see them. His grandfather, Henry, never scolded him for it. In fact, he'd smile warmly every time he walked by the living room window, where Ethan's creations seemed to come to life in the golden light of the afternoon. But not everyone shared their appreciation for the artwork. Henry had noticed the flyers at the mailbox. They were thin, yellowed papers stuffed in the slots of every home on the block, all of them stamped with a bold, official-looking logo, the Sunset Hills Homeowners Association. The papers had started showing up more frequently over the past few months, each one bearing the same stern warning. All personal decorations, including window art, are subject to approval. Please remove any items that do not conform to community guidelines. At first, Henry had ignored the notices, dismissing them as trivial. The neighborhood had always been quiet and peaceful. Why would a few harmless drawings be an issue? But slowly, he began to notice something unsettling. More and more neighbors were quietly pulling down their decorations, or worse, leaving their windows bare, as if some invisible force had decided to purge the neighborhood of all individuality. Ethan, unaware of the growing tension, continued to fill the windows with his vibrant drawings. The fire-breathing dragon on the front window was his latest creation, a swirling masterpiece of reds, oranges, and golds that made the entire house glow with energy when the light hit it just right. It was his pride, his gift to the world. But Henry could see it. The way the neighbors were starting to glance at the house with discomfort, the way their polite smiles seemed to hide judgment. That afternoon, as Henry sat in his favorite recliner, sipping a cup of tea, he noticed something strange. A pair of dark suits standing across the street. Two men, tall and rigid, their postures stiff with authority, were staring at the house with cold, calculating eyes. Their attention was fixed on Ethan's artwork, and they spoke in hushed tones, eyes flicking back and forth from the windows to the street. It wasn't just casual interest. No, there was something darker in their gaze, a judgment, a scrutiny that made Henry's stomach churn. The doorbell rang, a sharp, intrusive sound that shattered the quiet of the afternoon. Henry stood, his bones aching as he walked toward the door. The men outside waited with grim expressions, and as Henry opened the door, one of them flashed a badge with the words Sunset Hills Homeowners Association printed in bold letters across the top. "We need to talk about your grandson's artwork," the man said flatly, his eyes never leaving the drawing on the window behind Henry. Henry's stomach tightened. There was something off about these men, something that didn't sit right. This is going to be trouble, Henry thought. The air around him seemed to grow thicker, as if the weight of the coming storm was already bearing down on him. The air around Henry seemed to grow colder as the two men in dark suits stood on his doorstep. The taller one, with a sharp jawline and ice-blue eyes, took a step forward, his gaze fixed on the vibrant dragon painted across Ethan's window. His lips twisted into something resembling a sneer, though it was hard to tell whether it was contempt or amusement. The other man, shorter but broader, hung back slightly, his eyes darting around the street with a nervous energy, as though expecting trouble. Henry's mind raced, but he kept his face neutral. He had never liked people who thought they could control others with their rules, especially when they were cloaked in the false authority of an organization like the HOA. But this felt different. There was a certain coldness to their presence that made his heart pound in his chest. "We need to talk about your grandson's artwork," the tall man said, his voice smooth, almost too calm. "It's unsightly, and we've received numerous complaints from the community." Henry's brow furrowed, the heat rising in his chest. Complaints? From who? These men didn't belong here, standing at his door with their vague threats and demands. Ethan's drawings were just that, drawings. They weren't hurting anyone. Yet there was no denying the authority these men seemed to wield. Their badges gleamed in the sunlight, their voices cold and commanding, as if they had the power to reshape the very fabric of the neighborhood. "What's wrong with them?" Henry asked, his voice low but firm. The tall man's lips tightened, and his eyes flickered back to the window again, as if the drawing itself offended him. "They're a violation of the HOA's guidelines. Personal decorations like this must be approved." He paused for a moment, eyes narrowing, studying Henry as if calculating his next move. "You've been warned, and this is your final notice." Henry felt a rush of anger, but didn't let it show. Instead, he stepped back, giving the men just enough space to step inside, though he didn't invite them over the threshold. Something about their presence unsettled him, made his skin prickle. Ethan, who had been watching from the living room window, now appeared at his grandfather's side. The boy held a fresh drawing in his hands, an even more colorful version of the dragon, now soaring through a cloud of fire and lightning. It was his best work yet, a true masterpiece that he was immensely proud of. Ethan hesitated, then spoke up, his voice small but determined. I don't want to take it down," he said, holding the paper up to the men. "It's my drawing. I worked really hard on it." The shorter man glanced at Ethan briefly, then scoffed. "Your drawing? It's an eyesore. People like you should learn how to follow the rules." He stepped forward, his boots scuffing the porch, and pointed at the dragon. "If you don't take it down, we'll have no choice but to issue a fine. And then, well, there will be consequences." The threat hung in the air like a cold shadow. Henry's fists clenched at his sides, his old bones tingling with the rush of adrenaline. He knew the power of the HOA's rules. They could make life difficult for anyone who dared defy them. And yet, he felt a flicker of something else deep inside. Defiance. "Fine," Henry repeated, his voice now laced with barely contained fury. "You're threatening a child for a drawing." The tall man didn't flinch. "It's not about the drawing. It's about the rules. And you." He stepped forward again, his gaze unwavering. "You're making this more difficult than it has to be. Remove the artwork. Now." Henry's chest tightened, a wave of frustration sweeping through him. These men had no right to come into his home, to try to control his family's life like this. The rage that had been simmering inside him began to build, rising like a tidal wave. He wasn't about to let these strangers bully his grandson or take away the things that mattered most to him. But just as the silence thickened, just as Henry opened his mouth to refuse outright, the taller man did something that sent a shockwave through the room. With a swift motion, he spat on Ethan's drawing. The thick, wet spit landed directly on the center of the fiery dragon, splattering across the paper in a disgusting splotch of saliva. Ethan gasped, his face paling as he watched the insult unfold before him. The image he had worked so hard on was now defiled, a symbol of his pride ruined by the callousness of these men. Henry's blood ran cold. His heart hammered in his chest, and the world seemed to narrow to just the three of them. The intruders on his doorstep, and the boy whose spirit they had just crushed. How dare they? In that moment, something inside Henry snapped. The years of quietly tolerating the rules, the restrictions, the imposed conformity, it all came rushing to the surface. This was no longer about a drawing. It was about respect. It was about family. And no one was going to disrespect either of those things on his watch. "Get out." Henry's voice was barely a whisper at first, but as he spoke, It grew in power. Now, the words hung in the air like a threat, the silence between them thick and suffocating. The tall man, still holding his position on the doorstep, seemed to pause, just for a moment, as if assessing Henry's command. His lips twitched, and for a brief second, Henry thought he might back down. But then the sneer returned, more sinister this time. The spit on Ethan's drawing gleamed in the sunlight, a vile testament to their arrogance. Ethan stood frozen, his small hands clutching his latest creation, his pride and joy, too shocked to even speak. His eyes darted between the two men and his grandfather, confusion clouding his young face. This wasn't just about a drawing anymore. This was something deeper, something personal. Henry's pulse raced, his body trembling with anger that was almost too much to contain. He could feel his blood surging through his veins, and the weight of his years seemed to disappear. His mind, once foggy with age, cleared in an instant. The towering figure of the man before him no longer seemed so threatening. In that moment, Henry wasn't just an old retiree. He wasn't the man who sat quietly in his chair, watching time slip by. No. In this instant, he was a lion standing on the edge of a precipice, roaring at the world below. "Get out," Henry repeated, his voice now low and commanding. "You come into my house, disrespect my grandson, and think you can walk away unscathed. Not today." The tall man's expression faltered, just the briefest flicker of hesitation. It was a crack in his otherwise steely demeanor. But then, just as quickly, it disappeared. He stepped forward, his hands clenching into fists. "You're making a mistake, old man," he sneered, his eyes narrowing with menace. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Henry didn't flinch. The words rang in his ears, but it wasn't the man's threats that mattered anymore. The only thing that mattered was Ethan, standing beside him, staring at the defiled drawing. Henry's mind snapped into focus, his decision solidifying. The rage that burned in his chest wasn't just a fleeting burst of emotion. It was a call to arms. These men had crossed a line. He stepped forward, his movements slow but deliberate. The taller man didn't anticipate the sudden shift in Henry's stance. Before either of them could react, Henry grabbed the nearest object, an old sturdy wooden chair, and swung it toward the man, the heavy wood cutting through the air with a resounding crack. The thug tried to dodge, but he was too slow. The chair slammed into his shoulder, knocking him back with a force that left him gasping for air. He stumbled, crashing into the living room coffee table, the wood splintering beneath him with an explosive crack. The other man's eyes widened in disbelief. "You?" But Henry was already moving, his instincts kicking in with an intensity he hadn't felt in years. He charged forward, slamming his shoulder into the second thug's chest, sending him stumbling back toward the door. The man's breath caught in his throat as Henry's grip tightened on his collar, lifting him off his feet as though he were nothing more than a rag doll. The second thug reached for his phone, his fingers fumbling as he tried to dial for help, but Henry was relentless. With a swift twist of his arm, he shoved the man back, sending him crashing into the wall with a sickening thud. The thug groaned, the wind knocked out of him, his phone clattering to the floor. The first thug, now groaning from the floor, tried to scramble to his feet, blood dripping from his split lip, but Henry wasn't done. He wasn't backing down. He wasn't going to let these men bully his family anymore. Henry's eyes locked onto the first thug, his mind set on one thing: making sure they never came back. His hands gripped the edges of the coffee table, lifting the heavy wood with a strength that belied his age. In one swift, brutal motion, he slammed the table down onto the thug's chest, trapping him beneath the splintered wreckage. The man gasped, his eyes wide with panic, struggling to breathe as the weight of the table pressed down on him. He wheezed, trying to crawl out from under the debris, but Henry stood over him, a storm in his eyes. "This is your last warning," Henry spat, his voice low, gravelly. "Leave. Now." For a moment, the men were frozen in place, both of them staring at Henry with a mix of fear and disbelief. They had underestimated him. They had thought him weak, just an old man with a crumbling house and a tired life. But Henry had shown them the truth. Age had nothing to do with it. And just like that, the tables had turned. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Then, with shaky breaths, the two men glanced at each other. The moment they shared was brief but telling. They knew they were beaten. The taller thug, still recovering from the chair blow, slowly staggered to his feet, eyes darting around the room. His colleague, pinned beneath the table, managed to croak out, "We'll be back. This isn't over." Henry's gaze hardened. "I'll be ready." The men, their bravado gone, turned and fled, rushing out the door, with nothing but the sound of their retreating footsteps echoing behind them. Henry stood tall in the wreckage, his breath heavy, his heart still pounding. It was over. For now. But something inside Henry had shifted. This wasn't just about protecting his grandson's drawings anymore. It was about sending a message. They had just poked the wrong bear. The sound of the men's footsteps faded into the distance, leaving a heavy, almost oppressive silence behind. Henry stood there for a moment, staring at the wreckage of his living room. A splintered coffee table, a broken chair, the faint smell of blood and dust in the air. His heart was still racing, the adrenaline pumping through his veins like fire. But even as the shock of the confrontation began to wear off, the tension in his chest remained, coiled tight and unyielding. Ethan stood by his side, his wide eyes locked on the door, as if he half expected the men to burst back through it any moment. His grip on his drawing had loosened, but he still held it tightly, as though it were some kind of shield against the chaos around them. "Are you okay?" Henry asked, his voice softening as he looked down at his grandson. Ethan nodded, though his face was pale, his usual spark dimmed by the events that had just unfolded. "I'm fine, Grandpa." "But are they really gone?" Henry placed a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder, his rough fingers gentle against the boy's skin. "For now they are, but don't worry. We'll be ready if they come back." But even as he said it, a flicker of doubt crept into his mind. These men weren't the type to back down easily. They would report this, they would gather reinforcements, and they would return. But this time, Henry wouldn't be caught off guard. He glanced over at the broken window where Ethan's dragon still hung, now marred by the stain of spit. It was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. The HOA's cold control, the men's cruelty, but also a symbol of defiance. The dragon was still there, still standing, still breathing fire. Henry couldn't help but feel a strange sense of pride. They hadn't won. Not yet. He cleared his throat and gestured to the damage around them. "We got some cleaning up to do," he said, trying to lighten the mood. But the weight of what had just happened hung in the air like a storm cloud, one that wouldn't be so easily dispersed. As the hours passed, Henry did what he could to repair the damage. He called in a few favors with neighbors, organizing a makeshift repair job for the door and window. But even as the house began to return to some semblance of normalcy, his mind kept returning to the confrontation. There was a nagging feeling, deep in the pit of his stomach, that this wasn't over. That evening, as the last rays of daylight faded, and the house was bathed in the soft glow of the evening, Henry found himself sitting in his old armchair, staring out the window. Ethan had gone to bed early, the weight of the day's events still lingering over him. Henry was alone with his thoughts, his mind circling back to the men in suits, their cold eyes, their unflinching threats. What had they meant when they said, "This isn't over"? He knew the HOA had power, but he also knew they had underestimated him. But power works both ways. He had made them bleed. He had forced them to retreat. And now, they would come back. But he wouldn't be unprepared. Henry's eyes narrowed as a plan began to form in his mind. It was dangerous, reckless even, but the way they had treated Ethan. No, he wouldn't allow it. His hand moved to the side table, where his old phone sat. The screen was cracked, a remnant of years gone by. but it still worked. He opened it and dialed a number that hadn't been touched in years. "Hello." A voice crackled through the speaker, raspy with age, but sharp with the kind of wisdom only time could give. "Jack," Henry said, his voice low and determined. "It's time to call in a favor. I need help." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then a chuckle. "I knew you'd come around, Henry. What's the plan?" Henry's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We're going to send a message they won't forget." In the distance, the moon rose high above the neighborhood, casting an eerie glow over the houses below. Everything was still, quiet, as if holding its breath. But Henry knew the storm was coming, and this time he would be ready. The next morning, the sun rose with a strange sense of finality. The neighborhood, once so idyllic and serene, felt different now. The air was thick with the promise of something looming just out of sight, something that would shift the balance of power in ways no one had anticipated. Henry could feel it, an electric charge in the atmosphere, a tension that made his bones ache. He sat in his kitchen, sipping his coffee, the cup warm between his hands. His thoughts were a whirlwind, racing from one plan to another. How far would the HOA push? How far would he push back? The phone call with Jack had been brief but precise. Jack was the kind of man who understood the weight of loyalty, of old debts, and of the importance of standing firm when life tried to knock you down. Jack had connections, people who knew how to make things happen, people who weren't afraid to take matters into their own hands. Henry knew that if there was anyone who could help him now, it was Jack. Ethan wandered into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes, the exhaustion from the previous day still lingering in his expression. His dragon drawing was carefully rolled up in his hands, as though it were a fragile treasure, one that could be shattered with a wrong move. Henry smiled softly at him, the urge to protect his grandson swelling in his chest. "You okay, kiddo?" he asked gently. Ethan nodded, though the uncertainty in his eyes remained. "Yeah, Grandpa. Just thinking." Henry patted the seat next to him. "Come sit. We'll figure this out, all right." Ethan hesitated, then sat beside him, his small frame leaning into Henry's comforting presence. The boy looked out the window at the dragon drawing still taped to the glass. It was still there, despite everything. An act of defiance, of resilience. Suddenly, the sharp sound of a doorbell shattered the quiet morning. Henry stiffened, his body instinctively going on alert. His first thought was that the HOA had come back. But no, this wasn't the sound of an official visit. It was something different, something far more sinister. Ethan's eyes widened in confusion as Henry slowly stood, his heart pounding in his chest. He motioned for Ethan to stay seated, then moved cautiously toward the door. The last thing he expected to see when he peeked through the peephole was a man in a dark suit standing at his doorstep. The same man from yesterday. The taller one. But this time, he was alone. His eyes darted nervously over his shoulder, as if looking for something or someone. His face was drawn tight, a mixture of anger and fear, and his posture was rigid, the kind of stance someone takes when they've been cornered. Henry's instincts screamed that something was off, that the situation was more dangerous than it appeared. The man raised his hand to knock again, but Henry didn't wait. He opened the door just enough to block the view from inside, his expression cold. The man's eyes flickered with recognition, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Henry," the man said, his voice trained. "We need to talk." Henry's mind raced, the wheels turning quickly. Something was wrong. The way the man spoke, the way he had arrived alone. It wasn't just a request for another confrontation. This was different. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Talk about what?" Henry asked, his voice steady but sharp. The man hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "You made a big mistake yesterday." "We made a big mistake." He shifted on his feet, his hands twitching at his sides. "We're sorry about the drawing. It was inappropriate. But you don't understand the bigger picture here." Henry's grip on the door tightened. His mind flashed back to the words the man had spat. This isn't over. And now, it was clear. The storm was just beginning. The man leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. The HOA isn't just about lawn care and window decorations, Henry. You think this is personal. It's not. There are bigger forces at play here. Forces you don't understand. Henry's heart skipped a beat. Forces you don't understand. What did that even mean? What are you talking about? Henry demanded, his voice low and firm. The man hesitated again, his face pale, as if caught between a rock and a hard place. I'm warning you. Step away. They've already started moving. The HOA is just the front for something much, much bigger. And if you don't stop now, if you keep resisting, they'll come after you. They'll come after your family. And you'll never see it coming. The man's words hung in the air like a terrible omen. The warning was clear, yet it felt cryptic. Who was this man really? What exactly did he mean by bigger forces? Before Henry could respond, the man took a step back, almost as if the conversation had been concluded. But as he turned to leave, he paused, glancing over his shoulder one last time. You don't want to make an enemy of them, Henry. Trust me. His voice was barely a whisper, lost in the wind. Then, without another word, the man disappeared down the sidewalk, blending into the quiet neighborhood. Henry stood there for a long moment, staring after him, his mind reeling. He had expected a confrontation. What he hadn't expected was a warning. The thought lingered like a dark cloud, heavy and suffocating. What had the man meant? And who exactly was behind the HOA? Henry turned back to the house, a storm brewing in his chest. He could feel it now. The real battle was about to begin. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet neighborhood. The peaceful suburban streets had an almost eerie feel to them now, as if they were hiding something beneath their serene surface. Henry stood in the doorway, his hand still gripping the handle, his mind reeling from the man's cryptic warning. And now his family was caught in the middle of something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. He glanced at Ethan, who was sitting quietly at the table, his drawing still in his hands. The innocence in the boy's eyes reminded him of everything he had to protect. "Grandpa," Ethan said, his voice small but filled with concern. "Are we gonna be okay?" Henry didn't hesitate this time. He gave the boy a reassuring smile, even though uncertainty gnawed at his insides. "We're gonna be fine, Ethan. But we have to be smart. And we have to stick together." The shadows in the room deepened as the last light of day disappeared, and Henry knew that whatever came next, it wouldn't be easy. The storm was gathering, and they were right in its path. But he wasn't going down without a fight. He couldn't. The night fell quickly, as if the world itself wanted to hide from what was coming. Henry sat in the dim light of the living room, his mind whirling with the knowledge that something dark and sinister was lurking in the shadows, just beyond his reach. The cryptic warning from the man on his doorstep echoed in his ears, each word more foreboding than the last. "They'll come after your family. You'll never see it coming." He glanced over at Ethan, who was now sitting on the couch, curled up with his drawing still in hand, lost in the innocence of his childhood. But Henry knew better. Innocence didn't last long in a world like this, a world where hidden forces manipulated everything from behind the scenes. And now Ethan was caught in the middle of it. A knock at the door sliced through the silence. It was sharp, insistent, and it sent a jolt of adrenaline through Henry's chest. He stood, his movements deliberate but calm, masking the tension that had been building ever since the strange visit earlier that day. As he approached the door, his mind raced. Who could it be now? Another one of them. Or was it Jack calling in the reinforcements? But when he opened the door, he wasn't expecting what he saw. A woman stood there, her features obscured by a hood and dark sunglasses. Her presence was cold, unsettling, as if she was part of something bigger than herself. There was no one else with her, and yet Henry felt the air around him press down, thick with the weight of unspoken threats. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice steady, masking the urgency it was starting to claw at him. The woman didn't answer right away. She scanned him with cold eyes, then glanced over his shoulder into the house. It was only then that Henry realized she wasn't just looking at him. She was assessing him. "I need to speak with you," she said finally, her voice smooth but hard, like steel wrapped in velvet. "It's about your involvement with the HOA." Henry's eyes narrowed. The woman's tone made it clear she wasn't asking for a friendly chat. And though she had yet to make any overt threat, Henry could feel the danger simmering just below the surface. "I'm listening," he replied, his body tense, his mind already working through the possible outcomes. The woman stepped forward, pushing the door slightly open with a single gloved hand. Her movement was fluid, calculated. She wasn't here by accident. This was deliberate. "Get out of the way," she said, almost as an afterthought, as if she was used to being obeyed without question. "I need to see the child." "Ethan." Henry's voice was like ice, his protective instincts rising instantly. He stepped in front of the woman, blocking her path. "I don't think that's happening." The woman's lips curled into a thin smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "You misunderstand me, Henry. This isn't a request. You don't have a choice." For a split second, time seemed to freeze. The weight of her words hung in the air, and Henry's heart pounded in his chest. Who was this woman? And why did she want Ethan? Before he could respond, there was another knock at the door, louder this time. Not just a knock, but a rhythmic thud, as if someone was trying to break through. The woman's gaze flicked to the door, and for the first time, a hint of unease crossed her face. But she recovered quickly, her smile returning as she met Henry's eyes once again. "They're already here," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You won't be able to protect him forever." Henry's blood ran cold. He could feel the walls closing in. Something was happening, something much bigger than he could grasp, and it was about to tear his world apart. Suddenly, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the street outside, loud and unmistakable. Then, another set of knocks, this time at the back door. The house was surrounded. His heart raced as adrenaline surged through him, and his mind raced for a plan. "Stay here," he snapped at Ethan, though he knew the boy had already understood the severity of the situation. Ethan didn't argue. He simply held his drawing closer, as though it could protect him. Henry turned back to the woman. "What do you want with my grandson?" The woman's smile faded, and for the briefest of moments, her eyes flashed with something almost human. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a cold, calculating mask. "I'm not here to explain myself," she said, stepping even closer, her presence overwhelming. "I'm here to deliver a message." The sound of the front door splintering under force sent a shock through Henry's chest. Without thinking, he lunged forward, shoving the woman back and slamming the door shut. The woman stumbled but quickly regained her composure, her eyes now filled with icy fury. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," she hissed, her voice dangerously calm. "But you will soon enough." The door began to crack as the pounding grew louder. Whoever was on the other side was determined to get through, and Henry knew this was it, the moment where everything changed. He turned to Ethan, his expression fierce. "Stay behind me. Do not move." Ethan nodded, fear flickering in his eyes, but he didn't hesitate. The moment of truth had arrived. Henry had been warned, but now it was his turn to show them just how far he was willing to go to protect his family. And he wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The splintering sound of the door being forced open hit Henry like a punch to the gut. The woman at his back didn't flinch, but her eyes flickered with a brief flash of concern. Henry didn't need to hear the crash behind him to know that something was coming, and that whatever was on the other side wasn't playing by the rules. He looked at Ethan one last time. The boy, pale and trembling, clutched his drawing like a lifeline, a reminder of everything that was at stake. "Stay down, kiddo. Stay hidden," Henry said, his voice firm, the edge of fear carefully masked beneath a layer of resolve. Ethan nodded, his small form retreating into the shadows of the hallway, though his eyes never left Henry. The front door creaked as the figure outside continued to batter it, each strike closer than the last. Henry could feel the vibrations through the walls, and with them, the palpable sense of something far more dangerous lurking just beyond the threshold. This wasn't just about the HOA anymore. This wasn't a petty dispute. It was a war, and Henry had been thrust right into the heart of it. Henry backed away from the door, his eyes never leaving the woman who stood too close, her presence like a dark storm cloud pressing in on him. "You know," she began, her voice calm, almost detached, "there's still time to walk away. You think you can protect him, but you can't stop what's coming. Not even he can." Henry clenched his fists, the muscles in his arms tightening as the adrenaline surged through him. "You don't know me, and you definitely don't know my family." The woman's smile was cruel. "You think you're the first to resist. We've been doing this for years. There's no way out. No escape." Her words hit Henry like a punch, and for a split second, doubt crept into his mind. Could he really stop them? Could anyone? But then he heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps rushing toward the back of the house. They were closing in from all sides. No escape. But there was something they hadn't counted on: Henry's will to fight. With one swift movement, he grabbed the nearest object, a heavy cast iron lamp, and swung it toward the woman. It collided with her shoulder with a sickening thud, knocking her off balance for just a moment. Her sunglasses fell to the ground, revealing eyes filled with cold fury. "You're making a big mistake," she hissed, but Henry wasn't listening anymore. He was already turning, rushing toward the back door. The moment he reached it, the door flew open with a deafening crash, revealing two men, tall, imposing figures, dressed in dark suits, their faces shadowed by the night. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The sheer force of their presence told Henry all he needed to know. But Henry wasn't afraid anymore. He had come too far, fought too hard, and lost too much to let these people, these monsters, take anything else from him. "Ethan," he shouted, his voice sharp with urgency. He needed his grandson out of there, out of danger. Ethan appeared, his small figure darting toward Henry. His eyes were wide, but there was something else there now. Something stronger, something braver. He had seen too much to remain innocent, but it had also forged something in him. With a quick motion, Henry pulled Ethan behind him. "Run," he ordered, though his voice broke with the weight of everything they were about to face. But Ethan didn't hesitate. He knew the gravity of the moment. He grabbed Henry's hand, and they moved, quickly and quietly, toward the back exit. The men in suits advanced, blocking the way out, but Henry wasn't stopping. He shoved one of the men aside with all his strength, using the brief opening to push forward. It was then that he heard the crunch of wood. The front door had finally broken open completely. The woman, her shoulder visibly bruised from the lamp strike, stepped into the room, flanked by her two other operatives. This was it, the final showdown. "You can't keep running, Henry," she said, her voice cold, without mercy. "We're everywhere. We always have been." But Henry didn't listen. He grabbed Ethan's hand and led him toward the side of the house, where a shadowy alleyway offered a fleeting chance at escape. And then, like a tidal wave breaking against the shore, it all came together. Henry wasn't just fighting for his grandson anymore. He was fighting for everything. For the chance to live without fear, without the strings that had held them captive for far too long. His instincts kicked in. He fought with everything in him, every ounce of fury and love and hope that had ever burned inside of him. The woman lunged at him, but he sidestepped, his fist connecting with her jaw with a brutal crack. One of the men behind her made a move, but Henry was quicker, slamming a metal chair into his chest, knocking the air from his lungs. "Come on." Henry shouted to Ethan, urging him forward. The alleyway was dark and narrow, but it was their only chance. Henry could hear the heavy footsteps of their pursuers behind them, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid. They had made it this far, and he would do whatever it took to make sure they made it out alive. The woman's voice echoed behind them, laced with venom. "You'll regret this, Henry. You've no idea who you're up against." Henry turned his head slightly, his lips curling into a defiant smile. "I don't need to know. I'll make my own path." And with that, they ran, disappearing into the night, into the unknown, as the sound of pursuit began to fade into the distance. For the first time, Henry believed they might actually make it. They were going to win.